Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harris. I'm the Curator and Deputy Director here at Penlee House Gallery and Museum in Penzance, Cornwall. Firstly, I'd like to thank Art UK, Bloomberg Philanthropies and Penzance Town Council for allowing this to happen and for allowing me to talk about our amazing collection and our fantastic museum. And I hope you enjoy the selection of works that I've got. Actually, I'll just go back. We have an enormous collection of a wide range of objects. We have about 420 paintings, both oil and watercolors. We have about 500 works on paper. We have studio ceramics from the plethora of ceramic studios all around West Cornwall. We have a large social history collection, including Crusade textile firm. That's a famous textile firm from Newlyn and from St Ives. A selection of archaeology from the region and about 15,000 objects in our photographic collection. So we've got a very wide range of objects, but tonight I will be concentrating on 6 paintings from our fine art collection. Like many museums, our collections are made up from very kind donations, bequests, and the generosity of our Friends of Penlee House Trust, the Art Fund and the Arts Council. And we'll continue to grow and collect and grow our collections in this way. We use the collections to tell the artistic and social story of West Cornwall to a local, national and international audience. And Penlee House Museum and Gallery is owned and operated by Penzance Town Council and has been called the jewel in the crown of cultural Penzance. So a brief history of the gallery and museum. It was initially known as Penzance Museum, and it had its origins in the collections of the Penzance Natural History and Antiquarian Society from 1839. The museum contained a mixture of natural science, archaeology and ethnographical artifacts. It's like a typical antiquarian museum of the period. In 1867, the museum moved to new premises. In the mid-1800s, because no rent had been paid for the museum premises for many years, specimens were sold off to raise money and to clear the debt. The Society sold the collections to Penzance Borough Council in 1937 for a nominal sum, with the agreement that they would be displayed for the public good. At the end of World War II, the then Mayor, Robert Thomas, purchased 15 acres of Penlee Estate, situated in the centre of Penzance, through a public appeal. It was decided to use the house as a museum and art centre and the grounds as a war memorial. The museum was opened in its new home in June 1949. In 1985, the ownership of Penlee Estate reverted back to Penzance Town Council. In the 1990s, substantial funding was raised from a variety of sources, and the building was completely redeveloped, added gallery spaces, lift access, cafe and shop, as well as refurbishing the museum. Penlee House reopened in its current form in 1997, and in fact this year we celebrated our silver anniversary. Penlee House is in the enviable position of hosting the largest collection of Newlyn School and Lamorna paintings anywhere in the UK. And it's these schools that we specialise in, and subsequently it is from these schools that I draw my 6 collection highlights. I've chosen a mixture of works that are very popular with our visitors. They often get upset if some of them aren't on display, that are important benchmarks in both movements, and of course my own personal favourites. Like many participants in the Art Unlocked series, I wanted to use the opportunity to highlight the sometimes overlooked and underrepresented women artists in our collections. So I want to talk first a little bit about the 2 different schools and to contextualise West Cornwall's place in the wider pantheon of art history. So the Newlyn School, which started from the 1880s to the 1890s, so it's a relatively small period of time. Newlyn is a small fishing port laying about 1.5 miles from Penzance on the south coast of Cornwall's Penwith Peninsula. The area's spectacular scenery with granite cliffs and sparkling seas has attracted visiting artists since the early 19th century. In the 1880s, numerous British painters began to arrive at Newlyn, many of whom had trained in Paris or Antwerp. Most had also spent time painting in Brittany, and in Newlyn they found a similar source of inspiration, but closer to home with a direct rail link to London. Like Brittany, Newlyn offered scenes and lives scarcely touched by the Industrial Revolution, with plentiful cheap accommodation and willing models. Soon a host of artists settled, forming a colony known as the Newlyn School. By September 1884, there were at least 27 resident artists. Many more artists visited the village at this time, both for long and short periods. Initially, the artists were united in the desire to paint en plein air, depicting the lives of villagers in a rural, naturalistic style. As the colony declined, the common ethos evaporated. Elizabeth and Stanhope Forbes founded their School of Painting, bringing a new generation of artists to Newlyn. This re-energized the colony, re-energizing of the colony attracted further artists, many of whom later settled in Lamorna, forming the Lamorna colony, as often referred to as the later Newlyn School. So the objectives of the Newlyn School, of which this painting on the screen is a great example, were the subject matter. They were primarily interested in the Newlyn fishing communities. Their aims were not to sentimentalise or idealise their subjects, to depict what they saw in the utmost truthfulness, but that didn't mean being dispassionate. The method of work, as far as possible, was entirely based in the open air, but also they liked to examine the play of natural light in dark interiors. And their technique was to explore the possibilities opened up by the pioneering use of the square brush technique, particularly in their capacity to render atmosphere. The square brush technique became a hallmark of the Newlyn School. So the slide on screen is by Elizabeth Adela Forbes. It's called Zandvoort Fisher Girl. It's from 1884. Zandvoort is a little fishing village near Haarlem in the Netherlands. And the image depicts a younger working in the fishing industry. She's situated in a fish preparation room with its terracotta tiled floor and a wooden contraption, possibly for scaling and gutting fish underneath the tray of fish that she's holding. She's backlit with a light emanating from a small window visible at the top right. And her hands are often commented on by visitors, are large workers' hands. They're purple and swollen with the cold. She is looking directly at us, which is unusual for portraits at the time. She is fully engaged with the viewer. So a little about Elizabeth Adela Armstrong, who later became Elizabeth Adela Forbes. She was born in Canada in 1859, moved to the UK with her mother whilst in her early teens, to be schooled at Kensington Art School and then latterly known as the Royal College of Art. She continued her studies in New York, Germany and France, spending time at Pont-Auvergne Art Colony in Brittany, where she was introduced to the concept of painting en plein air. In 1885, she moved to Cornwall, first to St Ives and then to Newlyn, where she set up a studio and flourished, frequently exhibiting at the Royal Academy. She was friends with artists such as James Abbott McNeill Whistler and Walter Sickert, both of whom influenced her work and introduced her to the London art scene. Together with her husband Stanhope Forbes, she developed and sustained the Forbes School of Painting from its foundation in 1899 until her untimely death in 1912. Backlighting was a great interest of hers and can be seen in many of her other works, and it gives a kind of a halo-like, almost sort of religious feel to some of the works. Like I said, this painting is unusual because the subject directly stares out at the viewer. It's not as observational and as distant as some of the other Newlyn School artists tended to be. And there's a comparison there with a painting that Stanhope Forbes did a little earlier. But while his is observational and it just sort of tries to capture a street scene as it was, Elizabeth's portrait, there's a connection between the sitter and the artist, which I don't think you see in the other paintings. And it was a definite trait of Elizabeth Forbes's. So Stanhope Forbes was born in Dublin in 1857 and studied at Lambeth School of Art and the Royal Academy Schools. He arrived in Newlyn in 1884 and soon became a leading figure in the growing colony of artists. In 1886, he met Elizabeth Armstrong and the couple got married in 1889. As the number of artists in Newlyn dwindled in the 1890s, Elizabeth and Stanhope sought to redress the decline by founding their School of Painting. It's attracted a new generation, as discussed earlier. He remained in Newlyn long after Elizabeth's death and continued to paint well into his late 90s. This other painting, which is another one of our very famous paintings, is called School is Out by Elizabeth Forbes. This painting of 1889 illustrates the desire of the Newlyn artist to depict the natural effects of light. There are two light sources, a warm pink light emanating from the partially screened window to the left and a weaker light from the open door. The work was painted just 18 years after the Education Act of 1870, which ushered in the notion of schooling for all. With the creation of more schools came the rise in women pursuing a professional career as schoolmistresses. In this school scene, thought to be in Paul's School near Penzance, Forbes shows us that the majority of pupils and teachers are female. Now, the Newlyn School, there's father of the Newlyn School, the person who is thought of to be the father of the Newlyn School, is Walter Langley. So he was one of the first painters to settle in Newlyn. So this painting is called Among the Missing. And at first glance, it has an air of confusion about it. The leaden sky and rain-wet ground offer an insight into the sadness at the heart of this work. The central character, a young woman seemingly in distress, is being comforted by an older woman as she leads her away from the scene in the background. That scene is at the very heart of the narrative that Langley is illustrating. Just to the right of the post office door is a sheet of paper pasted to the wall. The paper contains the names of the fishermen recorded as missing from a recent disaster at sea. The name of the young woman's husband, brother or father, and sadly in some cases all three, had been added to the list, and she is inconsolable. The subject is the very essence of everything that Walter Langley wanted to use his paintings for. He saw himself as an artist and social commentator, much like Dickens before him, and sought to use his paintings to effect social change. In 1881, Birmingham-born Langley received a commission from a wealthy patron to spend the following year in Newlyn documenting the lives of the fisherfolk. Coming from a poor working class background himself, Langley was particularly touched by the hardship faced by the fishing community, and his paintings were filled with tales of tragedy, loss and hope. Langley is known as a pioneer of the Newlyn School, as he was the first Newlyn artist to settle in the village, setting up his studio in 1882. Like many of his fellow Newlyn artists, he'd spent time in Brittany and Holland before settling in Cornwall. Although Langley was an accomplished painter in oils, he mainly worked in watercolour and often on a large scale, as in the painting above. This method of working rewarded his meticulous attention to detail, which is partly a result of him being a trained draftsman. Using this demanding and difficult medium, he portrayed scenes of everyday life in the small fishing village, highlighting the hardships and tragedies that were commonplace during that period. This painting is actually the last part of a trilogy of works that narrate a tragedy that could strike a vulnerable fishing fleet at any time. So the first work, I apologise for the slight green tinge in this painting, it doesn't look like that in real life. The first work is called Departure of the Fleet in a Cornish fishing village, Departure of the Fleet to the north, and you can see a chap watching the fleet go out. They would often go away for 2 or 3 months at a time, often sailing as far as Scotland. So it would be a very difficult time. It was good that there was work and they were going out to fish, but at the same time, so it's optimistic in that regard, but at the same time it's sort of tinged with sadness, and you can see most of the people looking fairly solemn and distracted, because they're the people who are left behind and they might not see their loved ones for several months. It's also a really good example of the way that Langley treated textiles and clothing, showing the myriad of different ways they could be mended and fixed. And you could see both the chap with the telescope's trousers and the hem of the skirt of almost all of the skirts Langley ever painted have all got wonderful mends on them. The painting that comes into the middle of this trilogy is called Disaster, and it's the moment when a group of people from the village find out that a ship that was moored just off the coast but couldn't come in because of a storm had finally sunk. That's at Birmingham Museums. Langley was unusual amongst his fellow Newlyn School artists in that he was an atheist, a committed socialist. He played the banjo and he also tap danced. A lot of the Newlyn School artists were in theatrical and musical companies together, and they put on shows to raise money for local causes. It's sort of our top two paintings, as voted for continually by our visitors, is number one is The Rain It Raineth Every Day, which is this painting, and number two is The School Is Out, the Elizabeth Forbes. So this painting it's unusual. It captures the idiosyncratic charms of Penzance Promenade, probably in the winter, but it could well be midsummer. It changes little sometimes. It's a walk that I do almost every day, and I can confirm that it's bracing. This is one of our most popular paintings, and it's often commented on by our visitors because they recognise and empathise with the people trying to shelter from the water, simultaneously coming from the sky and the sea. Something that Penzance Promenade does exceptionally well at any time of year. While the painting has many tropes of the Newlyn School, painted on plein air with a muted palette and featuring groups of people going about their everyday business, its composition is unusual. Dominating the scene, and at the centre of this large expanse of canvas, is nothing. Garson has used absence as a form, making the focal point a large, grey, wet area of promenade showing nothing but the faint reflection of the surrounding buildings. To the right of the scene is a blue RNLI collecting box, one of the first of its kind anywhere in the UK, and another reminder of the relative closeness of tragedy. Norman Garstin was an Irish artist, teacher, art critic and journalist who travelled and painted widely throughout Europe before settling in Newlyn in 1886. Garstin said of the plein air approach to painting favoured by the Newlyn School of Artists, they were filled with the idea of the fresh, unarranged nature to be studied in her fields and by her streams and on the margins of her great seas. In these things, they were able to find motives in their art. In 1886, Garstin settled in Newlyn, where he remained for 4 years before moving to Penzance. The unusual composition in this work demonstrates Garstin's admiration for Japanese art and also his influence at this time by Whistler, whose work he also admired. Probably for this reason, the painting was rejected by the Royal Academy, but Garstin nevertheless considered it to be his masterwork and presented it as a gift to the town it depicts. Strangely, the blue RNLI collecting box that appears in the painting turned up on the BBC's Repair Show a few months ago. It had been taken there by members of the Penlee lifeboat station in Newlyn, and as you can see, it had been remarkably beautifully restored. It's now back doing what it always did, collecting money for the RNLI at the visitor centre in Newlyn, Penlee lifeboat station in Newlyn, and can be seen at any time. So the second Newlyn School, or the Lamorna colony, which lasted from about the 1890s to the 1920s and beyond, really into the 1950s, where it sort of slowly dissolved around the coast of St Ives into the modernist movement. By the late 1890s, many of the first generation of Newlyn artists had moved on, and a second generation took their place, drawn partly by the excellence of the earlier artists and partly by the opportunities offered by the area for cliff and landscape painting, but perhaps most of all by the Newlyn School of Painting set up by Elizabeth and Stanhope Forbes. This provided not only a first-class tuition, but a ready-made social life. a second colony centred around the landscape painter Lamorna Birch, developed in nearby Lamorna Valley. As with an earlier generation, some of the younger artists settled permanently, while others just visited regularly. So their aims and methods were slightly different to the Newlyn School, in that the social realism of the earlier artists gave way to landscape painting for its own sake. And the effects of light, already important with the early Newlyners, developed into an exploration of the unique clarity of the Cornish air and its effects on the sea and the sky and the rocks. They were also very interested in colour, more so than the Newlyn School. Often previously subservient to tone became brighter, stronger, and the effects of its juxtapositioning more important. The square brush technique had lapsed. However, the earlier freedom of texture merged happily with a looser, freer brushwork favoured by the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, both of whose work was now becoming known to the British artists. So this absolutely amazing portrait of Eileen Mayo by Dod Procter, unfortunately it's not dated, but it's probably painted around the 1920s when Dod specialised in portrait painting. And it was a theme that she would revisit many, many times throughout her career, to paint portraits and self-portraits. So the portrait is of Eileen Mayo, who was a friend, a model and fellow artist, and who modelled for both Dod and for Laura Knight many, many times. This is another marvellous portrait by Dod Procter, this time a self-portrait. And a little later in her career, this wonderful portrait of Aunt Lilla. So Dod Procter, who was born Doris Shaw and was known as Dod, as a nickname that she invented for herself, and I think she quite liked the analogous nature of it. In 1907, Dod was brought to Newlyn by her mother to study at the Forbes School of Painting, where she was recognised as the most talented pupil in her year. Another shining light in the school was Ernest Procter, with whom she formed an attachment that was later to result in their marriage in 1912. Procter and her husband attended art schools in England and Paris together, where they were both influenced by Impressionism and Post-Impressionism movements. So this is sadly not ours, but it's probably Dod Procter's most famous work. In 1927, Dod briefly became the most famous artist in Britain when her painting Morning, a sleeping girl softly draped in night clothes, caught the public imagination and was voted Painting of the Year at the Royal Academy. The Daily Mail purchased the painting for the nation, gifting it to the Tate Gallery, making Dod Procter a household name at the time. In 1942, Dod was elected as a Royal Academician, only the second woman ever to be so honoured, the first being her friend and fellow Newlyn artist Laura Knight. So this is a painting by Samuel John Lamorna Birch, who, as previously mentioned, was the kind of pivotal role in the second Newlyn School, the Lamorna Colony group of artists. And he was based in Lamorna, and because of that, a lot of other artists gravitated towards him. So this is a painting of Cerris Quarry, which is not that far from Penzance. In fact, a visitor recently told me that there were 4 quarries owned by their grandparents, and each grandchild was given a quarry of their own. They didn't quite know what to do with it, and it had subsequently been filled in. This painting typifies the change in style and subject matter as we move from the Newlyn School into the Lamorna Colony. The interest in colour, light, and the lack of narrative is evident here in Birch's painting. So Samuel John Lamorna Birch, the founder of the Lamorna Colony of Artists and Writers in West Cornwall, was born in 1869. He had a long-time association with Lamorna, a small settlement just a few miles along the coast from Newlyn, and so much so, in fact, that he took its name as his. In the early 1890s, Birch began making painting trips to Cornwall. For an artist excited by painting outside and plein air, Newlyn was considered the place to be. There was already a well-established colony there, at the centre of which was Stanhope and Elizabeth Forbes, who gave the young artist encouragement and introduced him to the small settlement of Lamorna. Unlike the Newlyn School artists, Birch preferred not to paint people. His subject was always a landscape. He was attracted by the brilliant light reflected off the sea and the verdant wooded valley. So this is a view down through the Lamorna Valley to, you can see Birch's house on the left, and there's a small settlement of other houses just around the corner there. This scene, one that Birch painted many times throughout his career, shows the Lamorna stream winding its way down the valley to the cove below, and is typical of his intense use of colour at this time. So the colour hasn't really come out very well in this slide either, but they're very, very strong pinks, blues and purples. In December 1907, Laura Knight first made the walk from Newlyn to Lamorna. Her first approach in the valley, she wrote, "It was well worth getting wet feet for. It would seem that we had suddenly entered paradise, a densely wooded valley with lichen-covered trees, all greenish grey, whose branches threw a bluish tracery of shadow over the primrose and white anemones. Violet-tinted granite boulders in the stream that found its way out to sea and to Lamorna Cove." And strangely, the abstract expressionist Mark Rothko, who visited Cornwall in 1959 and was taken to an exhibition of Cornish art at the Newlyn Art Gallery. And I often think of Mark Rothko when I see that Norman Garstin painting with the large panel of grey in the middle. He may have seen that painting at the exhibition, we don't know. But he did see this painting by Lamorna Birch, and he commented, on seeing the painting of the woodland in Lamorna, "I wish I could do that. Just go and sit in the woods and paint with trees and birdsong." So it's another example of those violet rocks that made their way down from the stream and out onto the beach. Obviously, there was a lot of quarrying either side of the cove at Lamorna, and this is spoil from that. And it's obviously still there today, and you can see it there today. So the final artist, final piece of work I want to talk about is Dame Laura Knight. And this work is unusual in that the ground is mostly white, which you don't normally get in paintings. They're very difficult to paint. So this watercolor shows a group of people working in an open clay mine. It's unusual that it's almost entirely, the entire work is described in shades of white. One can imagine how bright the scene must have been, especially when the sun came out. In the late 17th century, traders from the Far East began to bring back to the UK Chinese hard-paste porcelain, which is lighter and finer than the stoneware ubiquitous in Europe at the time, but was just as strong. British potteries found it impossible to replicate, as there's no known British source of kaolin, which is, in essence, the decomposed granite and the key ingredient in hard-paste porcelain. But in 1746, minister and pharmacist William Cookworthy discovered a deposit of kaolin in Cornwall, where it gained the name China clay due to its links to the Far East. The deposit turned out to be the largest in the world and began an industry in Cornwall far bigger and far more lucrative than the tin and copper industries more associated with Cornwall. The kaolin, which didn't require deep mining, was retrieved using open cast mining pits like this one. It was then blasted with water cannons to separate the soft clay from the decomposing granite. The water turned white and ran off into the rivers and down into St Austell Bay, and sometimes would turn the whole sea white. And you can see the rivulets of white water running down there. It's interesting to note the different way that the working people of Cornwall are depicted in this painting of 1914 compared to, say, Walter Langley's of the 1880s. Knight's workers lack the heroism inherent in Langley's work, choosing instead to paint them in an unsentimental, almost anonymous manner. So Laura Knight was one of the 20th century's most prolific British artists. Her career spanned nearly 80 years, and the extraordinary breadth of her talent encompassed a huge variety of subjects, techniques, and styles. Her achievements included being the first ever elected female royal academician and a highly acclaimed war artist, and became made a Dame of the British Empire. Born in Derbyshire in 1877, Laura's artistic talents were encouraged by her mother, who first went to study in Newlyn School of Art aged 13. It was there that she met her future husband, Harold Knight. As a female student, Laura had access to the study of the clothed figures, but not of the nude models like the male students did. She later complained that the regulation to the copying of antique plaster casts would induce a woodenness in her figure drawings. And I think it's interesting at this point that a quote that Laura Knight once said, talking about that disparity between male and female artists in both in the art school and in life, that Michelangelo had no baby's bottle or teapot hanging around his neck, which I think is very poignant and very true. We shall move on. Laura and Harold Knight married in 1903, and together the couple moved to Cornwall in 1907. They soon made friends with the community of artists in Lamorna, where Laura began recording the changing industrial landscape and exercising her passion for portraiture. So this portrait, which was quite revolutionary at the time, is a portrait of the artist, sub-portrait in the foreground to the left, and of Ella Napper, who was frequently painted by Dod Procter and by Laura Knight. And it's a bravura statement about the ability of women to paint the hitherto taboo subjects on a scale and with intensity, and it is a work that heralded change. In 1927, Knight travelled to Baltimore in Maryland to join her husband, who was working on a series of portraits in the hospital there. Rather than painting grandiose scenes, Knight chose her subjects as the black nurses and patients of the segregated wards, of which this etching is a very beautiful example. Dame Laura Knight, like all the artists that I've discussed this evening, found an affinity with Cornwall and were able to record that connection in their paintings. Penlee House Gallery and Museum are privileged to be able to show these works and many, many more to our visitors, many of whom feel the same tangible connection to the landscape, the people, and the place. Thank you very much.